Welcome back to Boringard the channel, where we turn the strangest, darkest, and most miserable parts of history into something you can suffer through from the comfort of your own home if you are a fan of bizarre traditions, forgotten pain, and the kind of facts that make you say, wow, thank God I was born in the era of snacks and streaming. Make sure to like this video and subscribe to Boringard, because what we are about to describe is so brutal, so relentless, and so deeply holy that it makes modern life feel like a vacation from the past today. We are stepping into the cold, damp, echoing stone walls of a medieval monastery, where the air smells like candle wax, ancient books, and unwashed robes, and where silence is law, food is a curse, and suffering is the currency of salvation. You are about to become a monk, and trust me, you are not ready in the modern world. If someone wants to live a life of simplicity, they might delete social media, stop drinking coffee, or move to a cabin in the woods and talk about mindfulness on a podcast. In the medieval world, simplicity meant starving yourself while chanting in Latin, cutting off your connection to everything and everyone you love, and being whipped for sneezing too loud. Monks were not just holy men, they were spiritual warriors battling temptation with pain, boredom with repetition, and sin with punishment. Their entire existence was designed to erase the self and replace it with ritual obedience and guilt, and it all started the day you walked through the gates of the monastery and said goodbye to everything that made you a person you were not born a monk, not usually anyway. Most monks entered the monastery sometime in their teens or early 20s, although some were dumped there by parents who thought the best way to get rid of a spare child was to donate them to God. If you were a younger son with no inheritance, or a poor kid with no future, the monastery was one of your few options. It promised food, shelter, a place to sleep, and most importantly, a chance to avoid hell, which in the medieval mindset was not a metaphor. It was a literal burning pit filled with demons' teeth and screaming souls, and the only way to avoid that was to suffer. Now in the hopes of peace later, so people took it very seriously, and joining a monastery was seen as noble, pious, and very possibly totally insane. Inside you took vows, and not the kind that let you get married and eat cake. You took the vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience, and depending on the order, you might also vow silence, which meant from that day forward your voice belonged to God, your body belonged to the monastery, and your will belonged to the abbot, who was basically the boss monk, and who could make you do anything from cleaning the latrine pit to fasting for a week just to teach you humility. Day began before sunrise, and when I say before sunrise, I mean before anything should be awake. Monks woke around 2 or 3 in the morning for the first of 7 to 8 prayer sessions, called the Divine Office or the Liturgy of the Hours, and these sessions were not short. They could last over an hour and involved chanting psalms in Latin, standing, kneeling, bowing, and trying not to fall asleep on your feet, because falling asleep during prayer was not just embarrassing, it was considered sinful and could get you extra punishment after. The first prayer came more prayer, then maybe some reading, then more prayer. And then finally, when the sun was rising, you might get a short meal, usually some bread and maybe a little weak beer, because the water was dangerous and beer was safer. But do not imagine a fun monk breakfast with eggs, bacon, and friendly chatter. You ate in silence while someone read from a holy book, and everyone chewed their stale bread in sync. Like a choir of regret, after eating it was time to work, and monks worked hard, depending on your order. You might be a farmer, a cook, a scribe, a blacksmith, or the guy who had to clean the toilets with a stick made of thorns, because cleanliness was next to godliness, and God apparently had a sense of humor. Work would go on for hours, broken only by more prayers and possibly more fasting, because Some days of the week required you to skip meals entirely, and if you were lucky, you got a second meal in the afternoon, but if it was Lent, or a feast day, or any of the many, many holy days that demanded fasting, you would go hungry and pretend to enjoy it, because monks were not supposed to complain. They were supposed to embrace suffering as a gift from God, and the more you suffered, the holier. Mayor clothes were simple, usually just a coarse wool robe that itched constantly, and a rope belt that dug into your stomach. You had sandals, or sometimes no shoes at all, depending on the order and the weather, and you were expected to maintain personal cleanliness, using freezing water in a stone basin once a week, if that sounds like hygiene was optional. You are correct. Many monks believed that the body was sinful and washing it too much was vanity. So some orders avoided bathing entirely and viewed body odor as a holy fragrance. Sleep was not much better than anything else. You usually slept in a shared dormitory on a wooden board with a straw mattress. If you were lucky, and some orders forced you to sleep sitting up or without any blankets, or even with your head on a rock as a pillow, because comfort was a temptation, and sleep was time you could be using to pray. Monks did not believe in naps, snacks, or breaks. Their time was not their own, it belonged to God, and every second had to be accounted for, which meant if you had free time, it was probably a test, and if you enjoyed it too much, you might be assigned extra penance just to balance the scales of holiness. But what really made monastic life feel like torture was the way it turned your own thoughts into enemies. Monks were trained to fear sin, not just in action but in thought. If you had a lustful dream, you were expected to confess it and punish yourself for it. If you felt pride, you were supposed to do something humiliating, like beg for food or clean the toilets. If you felt anger, even righteous anger, you were to go without speaking or eating until the feeling passed. And if you ever started to enjoy any part of monastic life too much, the abbot might step in and remind you that joy was a luxury and suffering was your jobsum. Monks took this even further by practicing self-mortification, which meant they would whip themselves, wear painful clothing like shirts made of hair or chains under their robes, or sleep in uncomfortable positions on purpose, all to train their souls to resist temptation and cling to God through pain. And if that sounds extreme, congratulations. You now understand medieval spirituality, which was not about feeling good, it was about being good, and being good meant hurting a lot. Average monks spent decades living this way, waking, praying, working, fasting, chanting, and punishing himself for being human. And when he died, he was often buried under the monastery, sometimes under the very floor, where his brothers would walk over his grave every day and pray for his soul, because death was not the end, it was the next step in a journey that began the moment you gave up everything and chose the path of obedience, silence, and holy suffering. Thank you for watching this first part of our deep descent into the world of medieval monks. If you enjoyed this strange and painful trip into the past, leave a like and remember to subscribe to Boring Got, because we are just getting started, and the next chapter of monastic misery is even more intense. Imagine it is the middle of winter, the wind is howling through the cracks in the stone walls, and you are barefoot, walking silently through the monastery courtyard at 3 a.m, because the bell just rang for vigils, and even though your feet are numb and your breath is fogging in the air, you have to get to the chapel on time, because if you are late, the abbot will notice, and being late means punishment. Maybe fasting, maybe manual labor, maybe just the look of disappointment that makes your stomach twist. Monks did not have coats or warm clothes, they had one robe, maybe a hood if they were lucky, and they were expected to endure the cold as part of their spiritual training, because comfort was the enemy and hardship brought you closer to God. And every monk believed that if Jesus suffered on the cross, then surely you could suffer a little frostbite without complaining. To vigils, you might have been allowed to rest for an hour, or you might be assigned a task like stoking the fire or sweeping the floor in silence before Lord's the next prayer of the day, which began just before dawn. More chanting, more kneeling, more trying not to fall asleep standing, and more struggling to understand the Latin words that had been memorized, but not always fully understood, because education was limited. And most monks did not join the monastery because they loved books. They joined because they had nowhere else to go and wanted to save their souls, even if that meant suffering. Every single day. Education for monks was a strange mix of memorization and obedience. You learned to copy texts by hand, and you learned to read scriptures but not to question them, and the idea of independent thought was discouraged because pride was a sin, and thinking you were smarter than the monk next to you was a dangerous path toward vanity which could lead to hell. So monks read in silence, wrote in silence, and spoke only when ordered, and even their thoughts were supposed to be quiet, submissive, and focused on God, which meant if you found your mind wandering during prayer or caught yourself daydreaming about the world outside the walls, you were expected to confess it and feel shame, because even thinking about a better life was considered spiritual laziness. And monks tried to erase their thoughts entirely by focusing on one single word or phrase for hours, repeating it in their heads over and over, like a medieval form of meditation, but not peaceful meditation. More like mental warfare against your own desires and distractions. They believed that the devil could plant thoughts in your mind and tempt you from the inside. So you had to stay constantly alert, like a soldier guarding a castle, and the castle was your soul, and the enemy was youth. Monasteries themselves were not peaceful sanctuaries. They were rigid, brutal places where every detail of life was controlled. The time you woke up, the time you ate, the way you walked, the way you spoke, the position of your hands during prayer, the angle of your bow. Every moment had rules, and breaking those rules, even by accident, meant punishment. Sometimes private, sometimes public, and always humiliating. The goal was to break down your ego and rebuild. You were into a vessel of God, but the process was long, painful, and relentless. If you ever felt joy or laughter, you were taught to crush it because joy was fleeting and could lead to pride, and laughter was often associated with the devil, who, according to some beliefs, enjoyed mockery. And chaos monks were trained to be solemn, serious, and self-denying, which meant even smiling too much could earn you a rebuke, and if you were caught joking or making light of a situation, you might be forced to fast, kneel on the cold chapel floor during mealtime, or stand outside during prayer as a sign of your shaman. It was not just behavior that was policed, but your very posture. Monks walked slowly, heads bowed, hands folded, eyes downcast. No swagger, no pride, no signs of individuality. Everyone dressed the same, ate the same, prayed the same, and lived the same, because unity was holy and difference was dangerous. The goal was to erase the self completely, to become one with the community, and through that with God. And if that sounds a little like a cult, that is because in many ways it was. But some monks went even further into the abyss of suffering. They joined stricter orders like the Cistercians or the Carthusians, where the rules were even harsher, and the silence was total. Some of these monks lived in isolation cells where they rarely saw anyone else, except during group prayer, and received their food through small slots in the wall. They worked alone, prayed alone, and were not allowed to speak at all except during emergencies or confessions. Their days were filled with manual labor and silence, and their nights were broken only by prayer and the sound of their own breath echoing in the cold stone selfies. Monks believed that silence was the key to hearing God, that words were distractions, and that true holiness could only be achieved by removing yourself completely from the noise of the world and even from the company of others. And while this might sound peaceful, it was anything but. The silence was oppressive. The solitude was crushing, and the lack of human contact could drive some to madness, but to them that was the point. The more you suffered, the closer you came to God, and if you lost your mind in the process, well, maybe that just meant you were too holy for this world. There were stories of monks who went blind from copying texts in dim candlelight, who developed chronic pain from kneeling for hours on stone floors, who starved themselves into delirium during long fasts, and who begged their abbots to let them wear hair shirts or chains under their robes to increase their pain, because they believed the flesh was evil and the only way to purify it was through torment, and some abbots encouraged this, seeing it as a sign of deep piety, while others had to rein in the most extreme monks to keep them from dying too fast. And despite all this, there were still lines that should not be crossed. Some monks who took their suffering too far were seen as heretics or fanatics, and could be punished by the church for going outside the accepted bounds of monastic discipline, because even in a world of pain, there were still rules, and those rules had to be followed to the letter. But even the most disciplined monks had moments of weakness, and when they did, they confessed their sins to each other in the chapter house, a special room where the monks would gather daily and confess their failures, no matter how small, and receive penance for them, whether it was falling asleep during prayer, eating too quickly, having an impure thought, or even just feeling annoyed at another monk. It all had to be confessed and cleansed and forgiven through acts of penance, which might include fasting, manual labor, isolation, or silence, depending on the severity chant. Through this daily cycle of work, prayer, confession, punishment, and silence, the monk lived his entire life until he grew old and weak and died, usually in the same monastery where he had spent his youth, sometimes surrounded by his fellow monks, who would chant prayers over his body and bury him beneath the chapel floor, where his bones would rest in the cold, damp earth, and his name would be remembered only in the prayers of the community. Thank you for enduring another long look into the dark, holy, and miserable life of a medieval monk. If this descent into spiritual suffering fascinated you, be sure to like the video and subscribe to Boring Gut for even more strange stories that make modern life look like a miracle of comfort and freedom. But not all monks made it to a peaceful, holy death. Some broke under the pressure of endless silence, relentless discipline, and constant self-denial, and when that happened, the consequences could be devastating, not just for them, but for the entire monastery, because a monk who lost his faith or his mind became a danger to the spiritual balance of the community. There were stories of monks who ran away in the middle of the night, abandoning their vows and fleeing into the forests or villages nearby, sometimes to start a new life, sometimes to disappear completely and be branded as apostates, which meant they were no longer part of the church and were considered spiritually dead even while they still walked the earth. And if they were caught, they could be punished severely, forced to return and perform humiliating public penance, or, in extreme cases, locked in a small cell with nothing but bread and water until their will was broken and they begged for forgiveness. Those went mad inside the walls, unable to cope with the isolation, the silence, the pressure to be perfect and holy all the time. Some began speaking to themselves or seeing visions. Others refused to eat or sleep or pray and had to be watched by the abbot and the senior monks, who would try to guide them back to sanity through more prayer, more penance, and sometimes physical restraint, because in a world where the devil was real and temptation was constant, madness was often seen not as a medical issue but as a spiritual attack. And yet despite all this, despite the hunger, the pain, the loneliness, the fear, and the cold, men still joined monasteries in every corner of medieval Europe, driven by faith, desperation, or a longing for meaning. In a brutal world where life was short and uncertain, the monastery offered something stable, something eternal, a place where you could serve a purpose and escape the chaos of the outside world, even if that escape came with a heavy price into life outside. It was not exactly easy. Either the medieval world was filled with violence, disease, famine, war, and constant fear of damnation. If you were a peasant, you worked from dawn to dusk and still might not have enough to eat. If you were a noble, you were caught in the endless game of power, politics, and death. If you were a woman, your options were limited, and your rights even more so. But in the monastery you had food, shelter, a bed of sorts, and the promise of eternal life, even if the path there was paved with silence, cold, and self-loathing. So, for many men, the monastery seemed like a better option, and once you joined, leaving was nearly impossible. The vow of stability meant you pledged to remain in the same monastery for life, and even if you changed your mind later, you could not just walk away. The church saw monastic vows as sacred and permanent. Breaking them was like betraying God himself, and very few men were allowed to leave without punishment or disgrace. Yet within this world of constant suffering, some monks found purpose and peace. They believed deeply in their mission. They saw their suffering as a way to connect with Christ, who had suffered on the cross for their sins, and they embraced the pain as a form of purification. They believed that every ache, every hunger, pang, every night spent freezing in a chapel brought them one step closer to heaven, and they held on to that hope through all the hardship. And not all monasteries were the same. Some were stricter than others. Some were located in cold, remote areas where life was harsher, while others were in more temperate regions where the food was better and the rules slightly more relaxed. Some monks had access to books and learning and became great scholars. Others spent their entire lives tending fields and cleaning latrines, but all of them lived under the same fundamental principles: obedience, poverty, chastity, and prayer. Daily routine remained largely the same across Europe: rising in the dark, praying, working, praying, eating, working, praying again, eating again, praying again, and sleeping for a few short hours before it all began again. The monotony was the point. It was supposed to strip away your attachment to the world, to kill the ego and train your soul to listen for the voice of God in the silence. And the silence was deafening. It echoed through the stone halls, through the cloisters, through the dormitories and refectories, through the hearts and minds of every man who had given up everything to live this way. Monks communicated with hand signals when speech was forbidden. They developed entire systems of gestures to express basic needs like bread, water, permission to speak, or confession, and over time these silent languages became second nature, part of the rhythm of their lives. Even during meals, which were eaten in strict silence, one monk would be assigned to read aloud from scripture or the life of a saint, so that even while eating you were being fed spiritually and reminded that your body was not your own. It was a temporary vessel, a thing to be disciplined and denied for the sake of your soul. And if you chewed too loudly or spilled something or looked too long at another monk, you might be given penance, because every detail mattered, every action was a test. And yet within all this suffering there was structure, and within the structure there was a kind of strange peace. Once you accepted the rules, once you gave up your will and your desires and your name, you became part of something bigger, a holy machine of prayer and labor, a chain of devotion stretching back through centuries. And that idea gave many monks strength, even when their bodies were weak and their minds nearly broken. Some monks became famous, not for their suffering, but for their scholarship, their writing, or their visions. Men like Saint Benedict himself, who founded the rules that governed so many monasteries, or Saint Bernard of Clairvaux, who preached the Second Crusade, or the anonymous scribes who preserved ancient texts by copying them by hand with aching fingers and strained eyes in freezing scriptoria, where the only light came from flickering candles and the occasional glimpse of daylight through a tiny slit in the wall. These men left behind legacies that lasted centuries, even while their own lives were short and painful. They believed that what they were doing mattered, that it had meaning, that the discipline, the silence, the hunger, the bruised knees, the empty stomachs, and the sleepless nights were all part of a divine plan, and that faith gave them the strength to endure what most modern people would consider unbearably so. The next time you see an old painting of a monk looking peaceful and serene, remember the truth behind the image, the cold stone floors, the punishing routine, the hours of kneeling, the painful silence, the aching hunger, and the unrelenting demand to be perfect in a world that punished imperfection harshly. And remember that for every monk who found peace, there were many who found only pain, and for every soul that was saved, there was a body that suffered in silence. Thank you for watching this third chapter of our exploration into the brutal and holy world of medieval monks. If you want to keep hearing the darkest, strangest, and most bizarre stories from the past like this one, make sure to like the video and subscribe to Boring Gods, because the suffering is just getting started. Some monks believed the suffering was not just for their own souls, but for the souls of others as well. They prayed not only for themselves, but for the entire world, for kings and peasants, for sinners and saints, and even for the dead, especially for the dead, because in the medieval world, death was not an end, but a dangerous transition, a time when the soul passed through purgatory, a place of fire and cleansing where the sins of a lifetime were burned away before a person could reach heaven. And monks believed that their prayers could help shorten that suffering, that their chants and fasts and sleepless nights could tip the scales of divine judgment and bring mercy to souls in torment. So monasteries often took donations from wealthy families in exchange for prayers for the dead. These donations helped support the monastery, and in return, the monks would include the name of the departed in their daily prayers, sometimes for weeks, sometimes for years, and sometimes forever, written in long books of remembrance and read aloud during the divine office, so that no soul would be forgotten. And this practice, while practical, was also deeply spiritual, a constant reminder that life was short, death was real, and eternity was the only thing that mattered. And yet the line between the living and the dead was thin. Inside the monastery, monks often lived among the tombs of their predecessors, walked daily over the graves of old abbots and fellow brothers, prayed in chapels filled with relics, bones and skulls of saints and martyrs, and kept constant vigil over the remains of holy men whose bodies were sometimes believed to perform miracles or resist decay. And in this environment, where death was everywhere, suffering became a kind of offering, a bridge between worlds, a way to connect with the divine through pain. And pain was constant. The tools of suffering were everywhere, from the cold floors to the hard benches, to the uncomfortable robes, to the tiny portions of food, and the never-ending schedule of prayer and work and silence and more prayer. And if a monk began to feel pride or joy or even the dangerous thrill of accomplishment, he was expected to crush it immediately, because humility was the greatest virtue. And the road to hell was paved not with sin but with comfort. Monks wrote about the temptations they faced, not just from the world but from within, thoughts that crept in during long prayers or solitary work, memories of home, longings for warmth or companionship, desires for food or laughter or love. And these thoughts were treated as dangerous distractions, signs of spiritual weakness or even demonic attack, and monks fought them with more prayer, more fasting, more self-denial, and, if necessary, self-punishment, striking themselves on the back with cords or branches, wearing hair shirts, or sleeping on bare stone floors in hopes that their bodies would forget what their minds refused to let go. Some monasteries even had designated punishment rooms where monks could go to confess their faults and be disciplined not by others but by themselves and this self. Punishment was not seen as cruelty, but as cleansing a way to regain spiritual focus and discipline the flesh, which was always seen as corrupt and unreliable, a vehicle of temptation that had to be controlled at all costs, and this belief was so strong that even the smallest pleasures were seen as threats. A soft bed, a warm fire, a full belly, all of them were suspect, because anything that felt good could lead you away from God. And monks were not only forbidden from pleasure, they were forbidden from forming attachments. They lived in community, but were not allowed to have friends, not in the way we think of friendship. Today, they could not show favoritism, or share secrets, or spend too much time with any one person, because emotional bonds were dangerous. They could distract from God, create jealousy, or lead to sinful thoughts, and so monks learned to keep their hearts guarded, their relationships formal, their emotions hidden, and if a monk was found to be too close to another, he could be separated, punished, or reassigned to a different monastery altogether. And the isolation was not just physical, it was emotional, spiritual, psychological, a constant pressure to conform, to obey, to remain silent even when you were suffering, even when you were struggling, even when you were doubting, because doubt itself was considered sinful and had to be confessed and cleansed and forgiven. And the longer you stayed in the monastery, the more the silence became a part of you, until it was no longer something you endured, but something you became. You. For those who survived decades inside the walls, their bodies worn down by fasting, labor, and prayer, their minds stripped of all vanity and ambition, their souls hardened by discipline and softened by faith, there was a kind of reward, not riches, or comfort, or praise, but a deep, unshakable peace, the knowledge that they had given everything, surrendered completely, and become vessels of divine will. And for some, that was enough, that was everything. But for others, the toll was too great, and even holy men broke down, and when they did, the consequences were often tragic. There were stories of monks who went mad during long fasts, who walked naked through the snow, proclaiming visions, who threw themselves into rivers or off cliffs, believing they had failed God or been rejected by heaven. And in those moments the monastery became not a place of salvation, but a prison of the soul. And no one spoke of these things openly, because to do so was to question the entire system, the entire purpose of their lives. And yet those who survived carried the weight of their silence like a badge of honor, the years of suffering transformed into quiet strength, the scars hidden beneath rough robes, the memories of pain turned into prayer, and when they died, they were buried without fanfare, without monuments, without praise, because their lives were never about themselves, only about God, and their absence was marked not with weeping, but with more chanting, more silence, more of the same eternal rhythm that had defined their destiny. If you imagine the life of a monk as peaceful or serene, remember what it truly meant to walk that path, the hunger, the cold, the silence, the fear, the pain, the endless battle against the self and the world and everything that made you human. And remember that for every saint who was canonized, for every monk who became a scholar or a visionary, there were thousands more who simply endured, who lived in obedience and died in silence, known only to the God they had served, without rest. Thank you for surviving this fourth descent into the life of medieval monks. If this story gave you chills or made you grateful for heated blankets and free will, leave a like and make sure to subscribe to Boring Got for more stories from the darkest corners of history, where even the holiest lives were anything but easy. But the life of a medieval monk was not just about personal suffering, it was also about power, because even as these men lived in silence and poverty and self-denial, their monasteries often controlled vast amounts of land, money, and influence in Fact, some of the richest and most powerful institutions in medieval Europe were monasteries and abbeys, places where monks lived like ascetics, but managed farms, vineyards, mills, and markets that generated wealth for the church and for the crown. And this created a strange contradiction between the image of the humble, suffering monk and the reality of the sprawling estates and economic empires. Many monasteries, built over generations, with donations from kings, nobles, and the terrified faithful, who believed that giving money to the church could save their souls. Monks were expected to reject wealth personally, but they often managed enormous budgets and oversaw hundreds of peasants who worked the lands owned by the monastery they collected tithes. They rented out land, they stored grain, they brewed beer, they copied legal documents, they served as scribes for kings and bishops, and all of this happened behind the cloister walls, where the world thought only prayer was happening. But make no mistake, monks were often at the center of local politics and economics, and they had to balance their spiritual duties with the demands of running what were essentially massive businesses, and this brought its own kind of stress, because even as they tried to live in obedience and poverty, they were constantly surrounded by evidence of wealth and power, and sometimes that temptation proved too great. Some monks became corrupt, hoarded food, drank wine in secret, snuck meat into their cells, or broke their vows of chastity with servants or guests. And when this happened, scandals erupted, punishments were handed down, and sometimes entire orders were reformed or disbanded because of widespread abuse. But the worst scandals were the ones that reached the papacy, because then the entire church could be shaken and reforms would be demanded, new rules written, entire monasteries reorganized or closed, and in the aftermath, monks who had done nothing wrong were still punished or reassigned, or made to suffer for the sins of their brothers, because in the monastery, individual guilt and collective responsibility were often inseparable, and a single scandal could cast a shadow over hundreds of lives. And yet through it all, the rhythm continued. The prayers, the fasts, the silence, the suffering, because the monastery was not just a place, it was an idea, a fortress of faith, a lighthouse in the dark, a place where time stood still and the world could be shut out. And while the rest of Europe tore itself apart with war and plague and famine, the monks kept chanting, kept dying, kneeling, kept waking up at 3 in the morning to sing to a God who never seemed to answer, but who they believed was always listening. Downed during times of plague, when entire towns were dying and cities were burying the dead in mass graves, the monasteries often remained open places of care and burial, where monks tended to the sick, prayed for the dying, and risked their lives to perform last rites. And in doing so, many of them died as well. Some monasteries lost entire communities to disease, and yet the survivors continued the rituals, carried the burden, buried their brothers, and prepared for their own deaths, because their lives were already a kind of living death, and the end was not something they feared, but something they prepared for every single day. And in a world where death was so common, monks became experts in the rituals of dying. They wrote manuals on how to die well, they rehearsed their own deaths, they prepared their souls daily through prayer and penance, and when one of them grew sick, the entire monastery would gather to pray and keep vigil, and when the moment came, they would chant over his bed, carry his body in procession, and bury him beneath the stone where he had once knelt. And if that sounds beautiful, it was, but it was also terrifying, because the same rituals they used for comfort could feel like chains, and the same silence that gave them peace could become a prison. And some monks died with smiles, while others died screaming, and no one could say for sure which ones were truly at peace and which ones had simply run out of strength. And still, the monastery endured generation after generation, year after year, the same rules, the same bells, the same prayers, the same suffering, and in that repetition there was something strangely eternal, a sense that time itself had stopped, that nothing changed, that nothing would ever change, that the only thing that mattered was obedience and faith, and the ability to suffer in silence without losing your soul, and for those who could endure it, who could give up everything and become vessels of pure discipline, there was a kind of transformation, not physical, but spiritual, a hollowing out of the self that made room for something else, something beyond understanding. And those monks became legends, not because they were famous, but because they were forgotten, completely absorbed into the rhythm of the monastery, until they were no longer individuals, but part of the architecture, part of the silence, part of the ancient heartbeat of faith. And yet the outside world continued to turn, and eventually even the monasteries had to change, because as centuries passed and empires rose and fell and new ideas spread through Europe, the old ways began to crumble, and monks found themselves at the center of debates about faith, corruption, and reform. Some monasteries were burned, others were looted, some were shut down by kings and queens who wanted their land or their gold, and others faded slowly into obscurity, their numbers dwindling, their rules forgotten, their walls collapsing under the weight of time. But even as the physical buildings crumbled, the idea remained. The image of the monk bent in prayer, silent and suffering, still haunts the imagination, and the stories of their lives still echo through the halls of history, reminders that once there were men who chose pain over pleasure, silence over speech, cold over comfort, who gave up everything in the hope of finding God, and who believed with every aching bone that the path to salvation was paved with discipline and blood and a frond. For that belief they paid a price no one can truly understand. Thank you for following this 5th chapter in our journey through the monastic world of medieval misery. If this story chilled you, or fascinated you, or made you thank your lucky stars for modern plumbing and snacks, leave a like and subscribe. Too boring got, because the next chapter is coming soon, and it only gets darker from here. But before the monasteries faded from power and slipped into legend, there were moments of resistance, moments when the silence cracked and the discipline wavered, when monks themselves began to question the systems they had sworn to uphold, not loudly, not with protest banners or revolution, but quietly, in journals and letters and whispered conversations that carried more danger than most outsiders could understand, because to question the rule was to question God, and to question God in a place built entirely on obedience could bring punishment, not just in this life, but in the one to come. Yet the cracks were real, and they widened as new ideas crept in from the outside world, through travelers, scholars, merchants, and the slow crawl of knowledge that no amount of stone walls could fully keep out. Ideas about reason, about science, about personal faith and salvation that did not require monasteries or rituals or pain. And for monks who had spent their entire lives in obedience, these ideas were both terrifying and seductive. Because what if suffering was not necessary? What if silence was not holy? What if the God they had suffered for had never asked for their pain at all? Some monks embraced the new thinking, slowly, cautiously, reading forbidden texts in secret, asking quiet questions, studying the works of ancient philosophers hidden between pages of approved theology. And for a few, that journey led them to write, to reflect, to question, to dream of a life beyond the cloister walls, a life they had never known and would never be allowed to touch, because they were still monks, and monks did not leave. Monks did not run. Monks stayed and suffered and died in silence. But not all of them stayed. Some left, fled, vanished into the cities, became teachers, healers, scribes, rebels. Some were caught and dragged back, forced to kneel before their abbots and begged forgiveness. Some were excommunicated, declared enemies of the faith, their names erased from the records, their graves unmarked, their memories condemned, and others disappeared so completely that no one ever knew what became of them, and in their absence, the monasteries closed ranks, tightened the rules, enforced silence with even greater severity, and reminded everyone that obedience was not optional, it was life, and without it there was only Cheosand in the face of that chaos. Some monasteries doubled down on the old ways, fasting more, praying more, punishing more, believing that if they just suffered enough, they could hold back the tide of change that was sweeping through Europe. But the tide could not be stopped, and soon entire orders were being dissolved by kings who saw the monasteries as bloated and corrupt, or by reformers who believed faith should be personal and free and not bound in chains of ritual and pain. And slowly the great abbeys emptied their walls, cracked their bells, fell silent, and the silence that had once been holy became hot-owned. Yet even as the physical monasteries faded, the image of the monk endured, not as a man, but as a symbol of absolute devotion, of the willingness to suffer for something greater, of a life stripped of pleasure and comfort in pursuit of salvation, and in a world that increasingly chased noise and speed and indulgence. That image became strange and powerful, a reminder that once upon a time people believed so deeply they would hurt themselves to feel closer to the divinient. In rare corners of the modern world, that legacy remains uncertain. Silent orders that still practice the rule of Benedict, still wake before dawn, still eat in silence, still chant ancient prayers in echoing halls, wearing robes unchanged by time, and while their numbers are small and their world is vanishing, the spirit of that ancient discipline lives on, not because it is easy or popular or comfortable, but because it represents something we have almost forgotten: how to recognize the belief that the soul is more important than the body, and that silence is not emptiness, but the space where the divine might be hidden for those who enter that silence willingly, who walk into the cold stone halls and leave behind everything they once knew. The path remains the same as it always was: wake, pray, work, fast, kneel, confess, suffer, sleep, repeat, until death comes and the soul is set free, or so they believe. And whether they are right or wrong, no one can say, because the life of a monk is not about answers, it is about questions, questions whispered into the silence and carried on the wind across centuries of devotion and doubt. Thank you for walking with us through this final part of the long, dark, painful life of the medieval monk. If you found this story fascinating or horrifying or oddly beautiful, leave a like and make sure to subscribe to Boring God, because the past is full of shadows and we are just getting started. If you thought monks had it bad, wait until you hear what medieval nuns went through, because while monks lived lives of silence, suffering, and spiritual warfare, behind cold stone walls, nuns lived almost the exact same life with added layers of invisibility, powerlessness, and at times pure horror, because being a woman in the Middle Ages was already hard enough. But being a woman who swore her life to God and locked herself away from the world, often against her will, was a recipe for pain, confusion, and repression so intense it makes the monk's story look like a warm-up. First of all, most nuns did not choose to become nuns. Not really many were forced into convents by their families as children, especially daughters who were not expected to marry, or whose dowries were too expensive, or who were considered troublesome, or simply too many, because in medieval Europe having lots of daughters was not a blessing, it was an economic problem, and the convent was a socially acceptable solution. You could get rid of a daughter without killing her and still claim you had done a holy thing, and once she was inside those walls, her life changed forever. A girl who entered the convent as a child would be separated from her family, her name often changed, her hair cut off, and her body wrapped in rough wool robes, and that was just the beginning. She would begin training in the rule of the order, which meant obedience, silence, and a strict daily routine of prayer and work, and she would be expected to give up everything she had ever known, including her own thoughts. Because, just like monks, nuns were taught that individuality was a sin and the path to God required the complete destruction of the self-bet, unlike monks who sometimes had roles in the outside world as scholars or administrators or advisors. Nuns were almost entirely hidden away behind cloister walls, often forbidden from speaking to outsiders or even seeing the sky. Some convents had small gardens or courtyards, but others were so enclosed that the women inside never left and never saw the world again after taking their vows. And this isolation was not just physical, it was mental, emotional, spiritual, a slow crushing of identity under the weight of ritual and silence. And if you imagine a convent as a peaceful place of gentle prayer, think again. The same rules applied as in monasteries: constant fasting, manual labor, silence, self-punishment, and endless prayer, sometimes up to 8 or 9 hours a day, broken into segments that began before dawn and stretched late into the night. And like monks, nuns were expected to confess every thought, every temptation, every failure, even if it was just daydreaming or feeling bored or missing their families, because all of these were signs of weakness, and weakness had to be crushed with prayer and penance. The penance could be brutal self-whipping, walking barefoot on sharp stones, sleeping without blankets, wearing hair shirts under their robes. Some nuns even wore iron chains around their waists or thighs to remind themselves that the body was sinful and pleasure was dangerous. And the worst part was that many of them believed it. They believed that their suffering was holy, that their pain brought them closer to God, and that their lives behind walls were worth it if it meant salvation, even though most never saw the world again or felt the sun on their faces after their vows. And it gets worse, because the convent was not just a place of suffering. It was a place of control and sometimes abuse, because in every convent there was a hierarchy, and the abbess or prioress held enormous power, and not every woman in charge was kind. Some were tyrants who enforced the rule with cruelty, punished perceived disobedience with isolation, silence, starvation, or humiliation. And because there were no men allowed inside and no oversight from outside, these abuses often went unchecked for years or even decades, and the victims had nowhere to turn, no one to help, and no way out. So nuns wrote about visions they had of God or the Virgin Mary or angels, but others wrote about darkness, about fear, about being locked in silence, with nothing but their own thoughts and the walls closing in. And some went mad from the pressure, the isolation, the fasting, the endless discipline, because, just like in monasteries, madness was not rare, it was expected, and sometimes even welcomed as a sign of divine favor or spiritual struggle. And instead of getting help, these women were told to pray harder, to fast more, to confess more, to embrace their suffering as a gift. And, of course, not all convents were horror stories. Some were places of learning, art, healing, and community. Some women genuinely chose the life and found peace in it, and some orders were more lenient, more open, more focused on compassion than punishment. But even in the best cases, the daily routine was still harsh, the silence still suffocating, the rules still unforgiving, and the pressure to be perfect still unbearable. And for every story of a saintly abbess or a visionary mystic, there were hundreds of forgotten women who simply endured, who suffered in silence and died alone behind stone walls. And if you are wondering why they stayed, why they did not run, the answer is simple. They could not. Leaving a convent was not allowed unless you were released by the church, and that almost never happened. Once you took your vows, you were considered married to God, and breaking that vow was seen as worse than adultery. It was a spiritual crime, and if you tried to escape and were caught, you could be excommunicated, imprisoned, or worse. And even if you made it out, there was nowhere to go, no family who would take you back, no place For a woman with no money, no name, and no identity except that of a failed nunand, just like monks, nuns were expected to remain chaste for life. No love, no marriage, no children, and even thinking about such things was sinful and required confession and penance, but that did not stop human nature, and there were scandals, hidden affairs, secret births, buried babies, and punishments that ranged from public shaming to life in solitary confinement, and these were not just rumors, they were documented, investigated, and in some cases punished by church authorities, who saw these women not as victims, but as moral failures, who had betrayed their vows. And then there were the strange practices, the rituals and relics, the mystical experiences that blurred the line between faith and hallucination. Women who claimed to speak to God, who received wounds like those of Christ, called stigmata, who starved themselves until they saw visions or bled spontaneously, and these women were often praised, held up as holy, but also feared, because no one knew if they were saints or possessed or simply mad, and their experiences became legend passed down through generations of nuns who were told to follow their example or suffer the consequence. Thank you for walking with us into the secret world of medieval nuns, a world of pain, silence, isolation, and invisible suffering. If you thought monks had it bad, nuns endured just as much, if not more, with fewer rights and even fewer ways to escape their fate. If this story left you haunted or curious or grateful for your freedom, leave a like and subscribe to Boring Gut, because the next chapter will reveal even more about the dark corners of faith and the forgotten lives buried behind stone walls. And so, after nearly 100,000 words and the weight of centuries, we reach the end, not of the lives of monks or nuns, but of their silence, broken for just a moment to tell you what it really meant to give everything to God in a time when faith was sharper than any sword, and the only path to heaven was through hunger and frost and pain and fear. We have seen the cold cells and the dark chapels, the bleeding knees and the broken minds. We have heard the prayers whispered through cracked lips in the hours before dawn, the confessions made with shaking voices, the footsteps echoing through stone corridors where joy was forbidden and comfort a sin. Have seen young boys taken from their homes, stripped of their names, and rebuilt as machines of ritual, men who never again laughed without guilt or dreamed without shame. We have seen women locked away behind walls they never chose, subjected to rules they never wrote, haunted by visions they could never explain. We have watched them rise and kneel and fast and pray and suffer again and again, not for glory or power, but because they believed or because they had no choice. And we have felt the silence that surrounded them, a silence so total it became a second skin, a silence that could protect but also suffocate. And in that silence something survived, not peace, not happiness, but something older and deeper. The belief that life was not meant to be easy, that pain could have purpose, that the soul was worth more than the body, that the self was something to be erased, and that God could be found not in triumph or joy, but in obedience, in repetition, in the sound of a bell, in the cold air of a cloister, in the numb ache of fasting, and that maybe, just maybe, salvation was waiting somewhere behind the silence. And maybe they were wrong, maybe they were broken, maybe they gave everything and received nothing, maybe their suffering was pointless and their prayers unheard, maybe the walls they built only kept out the light, but maybe not. Maybe in those final moments when the breath slowed and the body failed and the candle burned low, maybe something came, maybe some whisper in the silence, some warmth in the dark, something that made it all worth it, something we cannot see or understand because we were not there and will never be. And maybe that is the point, because the life of a medieval monk or nun was not meant for us. It was not meant to be understood, it was meant to be lived and suffered and endured. in total devotion, and whether they found God or only madness, we will never truly know, but what we do know is that they believed, and they obeyed, and they suffered, and they sang, and they worked, and they died, and now all that remains is the silence they left behind. So, the next time you light a candle, or sit alone in the quiet, or wonder what it means to live a life with purpose, remember them not as saints or martyrs or fools, but as people who chose or were chosen to live in a way that most of us never could, people who believed that every moment mattered, that every pain had meaning, and that even if the world forgot them, God would not thank you for watching this final chapter of our journey through the darkest, quietest, most devoted corners of history. If this story moved you or shook you or made you look at faith and silence and suffering in a new way, please like the video and subscribe to Boring Got. Because while this story ends here, there are always more waiting in the shadows of the past.